NASA's director had no idea that every day his black female employees had to walk more than 2 miles to get to the black restroom. But when he discovered the truth, he transformed the entire space program. In the sweltering heat of Hampton, Virginia, 1961, the Langley Research Center bustled with activity. The space race was in full swing, and NASA was pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and technology. Amidst the sea of white male faces, a small group of black women worked tirelessly, their brilliant minds crunching numbers and solving complex mathematical problems that would help put a man on the moon. Among these human computers was Dorothy Vaughan, a 50-year-old mathematician who had been with NASA, NASA's predecessor, since 1943. Despite her years of dedicated service and her role as the first black supervisor at the center, Dorothy still faced daily reminders of the deeply entrenched racial segregation that permeated every aspect of life in the South. Katherine Johnson, 43, was another exceptional mathematician in Dorothy's group. Her quick mind and attention to detail had already earned her a reputation for reliability, even among the white engineers. However, her daily reality was a stark contrast to the cutting-edge work she performed. Like Dorothy and the other black women, Katherine was forced to use separate facilities, eat at separate tables, and endure the indignity of walking over a mile to use the colored restroom. Mary Jackson, 35, was the youngest of the trio, but no less determined. An aspiring engineer, Mary chafed against the restrictions placed on her because of her race and gender. She dreamed of breaking through the glass ceiling and becoming NASA's first black female engineer. Overseeing the entire Langley Research Center was Director Robert Gilruth, a 47-year-old aerospace engineer with a passion for space exploration. Gilruth was so focused on the monumental task of putting an American in space that he remained largely oblivious to the daily struggles of his black female employees. He prided himself on running an efficient operation and believed that merit alone determined one's success at NASA. As the summer of 1961 approached, tensions were high both inside and outside the research center. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion had heightened Cold War anxieties, and the civil rights movement was gaining momentum across the nation. Within NASA, the pressure to catch up to the Soviet Union's space achievements was intense. Little did any of them know that a series of events was about to unfold that would not only challenge the racial status quo at NASA, but also play a crucial role in the future of the American space program. The lives of Dorothy, Katherine, Mary, and Director Gilruth were about to intersect in ways none of them could have anticipated, setting the stage for a transformation that would ripple through NASA and beyond. On a particularly humid Tuesday morning in June, Katherine Johnson arrived at her desk, her mind already racing with the calculations she needed to complete for the upcoming Mercury Atlas 6 mission. As she settled in, she noticed a memo on her desk requesting her presence at a briefing with the Flight Dynamics team later that afternoon. Katherine's heart raced with excitement and apprehension. This was an unprecedented opportunity. Black computers were rarely, if ever, invited to such high-level meetings. She knew her work was impeccable, but the thought of presenting it to a room full of white male engineers filled her with a mix of determination and anxiety. As the morning progressed, Katherine found herself needing to use the restroom. With a resigned sigh, she gathered her things and began the long walk to the colored bathroom in the west area, nearly half a mile away. The summer heat was oppressive, and by the time she returned to her desk, precious time had been lost. Meanwhile, Director Gilruth was in his office poring over progress reports and feeling the weight of the space race on his shoulders. The Soviets had already put the first man in space, and President Kennedy's recent declaration that America would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade had only intensified the pressure. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Paul Manners, one of the lead engineers on the Mercury program. "Sir," Manners began, "we're having some issues with the flight trajectories for MA6. I think we need to bring in that computer, Johnson. Her calculations have been spot on." Gilruth nodded. "Of course, whatever we need to get this right. Is she available for the briefing this afternoon?" "She should be," Manners replied. "I left a memo on her desk this morning." As the afternoon approached, Catherine made her way to the briefing room, her heart pounding. She clutched her notebooks tightly, years of calculations and innovative problem-solving contained within their pages. As she entered the room, conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath and walked to an empty seat. Director Gilruth arrived moments later, nodding briefly to Catherine before taking his place at the head of the table. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that there were significant discrepancies in the trajectory calculations for John Glenn's upcoming orbital flight. Catherine listened intently, her mind already working on the problem. When there was a lull in the discussion, she tentatively raised her hand. "Excuse me, sir," she said, addressing Gilruth directly. "I believe I might have a solution." Gilruth, surprised by her interjection, but desperate for answers, gestured for her to continue. Catherine stood and approached the blackboard, her chalk flying across its surface as she explained her calculations. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the elegant mathematical dance unfolding before them. As Catherine finished her explanation, a palpable sense of awe filled the room. Gilruth himself was impressed. "Miss Johnson," he said, "I believe you've just solved our problem. Excellent work." Catherine beamed with pride, but her moment of triumph was short-lived. As the meeting adjourned and she prepared to leave, she realized with dismay that she needed to use the restroom again. The long walk to the colored bathroom would make her late for her next assignment. Gathering her courage, Catherine approached Director Gilruth. "Excuse me, sir," she began hesitantly. "I was wondering if I might be excused for a short while. I need to use the restroom, but it's quite a distance to the west area." Gilruth furrowed his brow, confusion evident on his face. "The west area? Why on earth would you need to go all the way over there? There's a restroom just down the hall." Catherine swallowed hard, realizing that the director was unaware of the segregated facilities. "Sir, I'm not allowed to use that restroom. I have to use the colored restroom in the west area." The director's face went through a range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then a dawning realization. He had been so focused on the space race that he had failed to notice the daily indignities faced by his black employees. "Miss Johnson," he said slowly, "are you telling me that you and the other colored computers have to walk to a separate building just to use the restroom?" Catherine nodded, her heart pounding. She had never directly confronted a white superior about the segregation before, and she wasn't sure what the consequences might be. Gilruth's jaw tightened. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, more to himself than to Catherine. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Miss Johnson. You may use any restroom you need to. If anyone gives you trouble, send them to me." As Catherine left the room, her mind reeling from the interaction, she had no idea that this simple exchange was about to set in motion a series of events that would challenge the very foundations of segregation at NASA. The day after the briefing, Director Gilruth couldn't shake the unsettling revelation about the segregated facilities. He decided to investigate further, determined to understand the full extent of the situation. Under the guise of a routine inspection, he made his way to the West Computing Group, where Dorothy Vaughn and her team worked. As he entered the area, he was struck by the stark contrast to the main building. The West area was older, more cramped, and lacked the modern amenities of the primary research center. He watched as Dorothy efficiently managed her team, assigning complex calculations and reviewing work with a keen eye. Approaching Dorothy, Gilruth introduced himself, though he knew who she was from personnel files. "Ms. Vaughn, I wonder if you might give me a tour of your facilities?" Dorothy, surprised by the director's presence but maintaining her composure, nodded. "Of course, sir, though there isn't much to see." As they walked, Gilruth asked pointed questions about their working conditions, equipment, and daily routines. When they reached the small, outdated bathroom, he paused. "Ms. Vaughn, how many women work in this section?" "We have about 30 computers in the West group, sir," Dorothy replied. Gilruth did some quick mental math. "And this is the only bathroom available to all of you?" Dorothy hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir, unless we walk to the other colored bathrooms in the far buildings." The director's face darkened as he realized the full implications. Not only were these women facing discrimination, but their productivity was also being severely hampered by these unnecessary restrictions. As they continued the tour, Gilruth noticed Mary Jackson working on what appeared to be advanced engineering problems. Intrigued, he approached her desk. "What are you working on, Miss?" "Jackson, sir. Mary Jackson," she replied, straightening in her chair. "I'm assisting the aeronautical engineers with some wind tunnel calculations." Gilruth examined her work, impressed by its complexity. "This is excellent work, Miss Jackson. Have you considered becoming an engineer yourself?" Mary's eyes lit up, but her expression quickly fell. "I would love to, sir, but... well, there are certain restrictions." "What kind of restrictions?" Gilruth pressed. Well, Mary took a deep breath before explaining the segregation laws that prevented her from taking the necessary night classes at the all-white Hampton High School to qualify for the engineering program. As Gilruth left the West area, his mind was reeling from everything he had learned. He had always prided himself on running a meritocracy, focused solely on advancing America's space program. Now, he was faced with the uncomfortable truth that systemic racism was not only morally wrong, but was actively hindering NASA's progress. Back in his office, Gilruth called for an immediate meeting with his top administrators. As they filed in, confusion evident on their faces, he took a deep breath. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice firm, "we have a serious problem that has been overlooked for far too long. Our segregation policies are not only unjust, but are actively impeding our mission to win the space race." The room fell silent as Gilruth recounted what he had discovered. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. As he finished, Gilruth looked around the room, his expression resolute. "This ends now. We're going to integrate our facilities, and we're going to do it immediately. The future of our space program depends on it." In the days following his discovery, Director Gilruth found himself at a crossroads. The decision to desegregate NASA's facilities was not one he could make lightly or implement without consequence. He spent sleepless nights weighing the potential fallout against what he now understood to be a moral and practical imperative. Finally, after much deliberation, Gilruth made his decision. He would push for immediate desegregation of all NASA facilities, starting with Langley Research Center. He knew this move would face resistance, both from within NASA and from the local community, but he was determined to see it through. Early one morning, Gilruth called a center-wide meeting. As employees filed into the auditorium, a palpable tension filled the air. Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary sat together, exchanging nervous glances. They had heard rumors of changes coming, but weren't sure what to expect. Gilruth took the stage, his face set with determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I've called you here today to announce some significant changes to our operations." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces before him. Effective immediately, all segregated facilities at Langley Research Center will be abolished. There will be no more colored restrooms, no more colored cafeterias, no more segregated computing groups. We are one NASA, working together towards one goal, and it's high time our facilities reflected that unity. A shocked silence fell over the room, followed by a burst of murmurs. Some faces showed relief and joy, others anger and disbelief. Gilruth raised his hands for quiet. "I understand this may be difficult for some of you to accept, but let me be clear, this is not up for debate. Anyone who cannot abide by these new policies is free to seek employment elsewhere." As the meeting adjourned, the consequences of Gilruth's decision began to unfold rapidly. Some white employees, particularly those from the local area, were outraged. A small group of engineers threatened to quit on the spot. Gilruth stood firm, reminding them of the importance of their work and the talent they would be losing if they continued to embrace segregation. For Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary, the announcement was nothing short of revolutionary. As they left the auditorium, Catherine turned to her friends, tears in her eyes. "Can you believe it? No more long walks to the bathroom. No more separate cafeterias." Mary nodded, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "It's a start," she said cautiously, "but we still have a long way to go." Dorothy, ever the pragmatist, was already thinking ahead. "This is going to cause quite a stir. We need to be prepared for backlash." Her words proved prophetic. As news of the desegregation spread, local segregationists began to protest outside the Langley gates. Gilruth received angry calls from local politicians and community leaders, demanding he rescind his decision. Some threatened to use their influence to cut NASA's funding. Within NASA, the transition was far from smooth. Some white employees refused to share facilities with their black colleagues, leading to tense standoffs in hallways and cafeterias. Gilruth had to personally intervene in several situations, reiterating his zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Despite the challenges, Gilruth stood firm in his decision. He arranged for sensitivity training for all employees and made it clear that any form of discrimination would result in immediate termination. He also reached out to civil rights leaders for advice on how to handle the transition more effectively. For Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary, the changes brought new opportunities, but also new pressures. They found themselves thrust into the spotlight as the faces of integration at NASA. While many of their white colleagues were supportive, others were openly hostile. Catherine, in particular, felt the weight of this new reality. Her calculations were becoming increasingly crucial to the Mercury program, but she now had to contend with resentment from some of the white mathematicians who felt threatened by her growing influence. One afternoon, as Catherine was working late on calculations for John Glenn's orbital flight, she overheard two engineers talking in the hallway. "Can you believe Gilruth is letting that colored girl work on Glenn's numbers?" one said. "If anything goes wrong, it'll be on her head." Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she continued her work, but she refused to let their words deter her. She knew the stakes of her calculations, not just for the space program, but for every black employee at NASA whose future depended on her success. As the weeks passed, the initial shock of the desegregation began to wear off. Slowly but surely, a new normal began to emerge at Langley. The protests outside the gates dwindled, and inside, people of all races began to work side by side with increasing comfort. Gilruth watched these developments with a mixture of pride and determination. He knew that desegregation was just the first step in a long journey towards true equality. But as he saw Catherine confidently striding into high-level meetings, Mary pursuing her engineering dreams with renewed vigor, and Dorothy leading an integrated computing team, he felt certain that he had made the right decision. The road ahead would be challenging, but Gilruth was more convinced than ever that by harnessing the full potential of all its employees, regardless of race or gender, NASA was positioning itself not just to win the space race, but to push the boundaries of human achievement in ways that would have been impossible before. As the main story of NASA's desegregation unfolded, a secondary plot began to develop around Mary Jackson's quest to become an engineer. Inspired by the recent changes and emboldened by Director Gilruth's support, Mary decided to pursue her dream of becoming NASA's first black female engineer. However, the path to achieving this goal was far from straightforward. Despite the desegregation of NASA's facilities, Mary still faced a significant hurdle. She needed to take graduate-level math and physics courses that were only offered at the all-white Hampton High School. Determined to overcome this obstacle, Mary petitioned the city of Hampton to allow her to attend the segregated school. Her request was initially met with resistance from local officials, who were already dealing with the fallout from NASA's desegregation. Director Gilruth, upon learning of Mary's struggle, decided to leverage his influence to support her cause. He wrote a letter to the school board, emphasizing Mary's exceptional skills and the importance of her potential contributions to the space program. Meanwhile, Dorothy Vaughan, seeing the changing landscape at NASA, made a bold decision of her own. Recognizing the growing importance of electronic computers, she began teaching herself and her team the Fortran programming language. She understood that adapting to this new technology would be crucial for their future at NASA. Katherine Johnson, for her part, was becoming increasingly involved in the most critical calculations for the Mercury program. Her work was gaining recognition, and she was often requested by name for important projects. However, this growing prominence also made her a target for those who resented the recent changes. One day, Catherine found her calculations for a crucial mission had been tampered with. She quickly realized the error and corrected it, potentially averting a disaster. The incident led to an investigation that exposed lingering resentment and resistance to integration within certain segments of NASA's workforce. As these individual stories unfolded, they intersected with and influenced the larger narrative of NASA's transformation. Mary's fight for education rights brought attention to the broader civil rights struggles beyond NASA's gates. Dorothy's foresight in embracing computer technology positioned her team at the forefront of NASA's technological evolution, and Catherine's ongoing excellence, despite adversity, continued to break down barriers and change perceptions. Director Gilruth found himself not just overseeing the desegregation of facilities, but actively working to create a more inclusive and forward-thinking culture at NASA. He began to see that true integration went beyond sharing spaces. It meant ensuring equal opportunities for advancement, recognition of diverse contributions, and fostering an environment where everyone could thrive. As the summer of 1961 drew to a close, these intertwining stories were creating a new narrative at NASA, one of challenge, perseverance, and gradual transformation. The space agency was not just racing to the moon, it was becoming a reluctant but increasingly committed player in the broader struggle for civil rights and equality. As the changes at NASA continued to unfold, the relationships between key characters evolved in significant ways. The shared experiences of breaking barriers and facing adversity forged stronger bonds among Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary, while also reshaping their interactions with their white colleagues and superiors. Dorothy Vaughan, in her role as supervisor, found herself navigating a complex new landscape. With the integration of the computing groups, she was now overseeing both black and white computers. Some of the white women initially resisted her authority, but Dorothy's exceptional management skills and deep knowledge of both human computing and the new electronic systems gradually won their respect. One day, a young white computer named Margaret came to Dorothy with a problem she couldn't solve. Dorothy patiently walked her through the solution, explaining each step. As understanding dawned on Margaret's face, she smiled genuinely at Dorothy for the first time. "Thank you, Mrs. Vaughan," she said. "I see why they made you supervisor. You really know your stuff." This small moment of connection was repeated in various ways across the center, as people who had been separated by segregation began to work closely together and recognize each other's humanity and talents. Katherine Johnson's relationships with the engineers she worked with were also evolving. As her calculations proved crucial to the success of multiple missions, she gained more vocal advocates among the white male engineers. Al Harrison, the director of the Space Task Group, became one of her strongest supporters. During a tense meeting about John Glenn's upcoming orbital flight, an engineer questioned the accuracy of the computer-generated numbers. Glenn, who had developed a respect for Catherine's skills, spoke up. "Get the girl to check the numbers," he said, referring to Catherine. "If she says the numbers are good, I'm ready to go." This vote of confidence from an astronaut marked a significant shift in how Catherine was perceived. It also deepened her sense of responsibility and connection to the mission. Mary Jackson's quest to become an engineer led her to form an unlikely alliance with Kazimierz Czarnecki, a Polish-born aeronautical engineer at NASA. Czarnecki recognized Mary's potential and became her mentor, encouraging her to pursue her goal despite the obstacles. Their relationship was initially awkward, with both unsure how to navigate the racial dynamics. But as they worked together on wind tunnel experiments, a genuine respect and friendship developed. Czarnecki went out of his way to teach Mary advanced concepts, staying late after work to explain complex aerodynamic principles. One evening, as they were poring over some particularly challenging calculations, Mary looked up at Czarnecki with tears in her eyes. "Why are you helping me like this?" she asked. Czarnecki paused, considering his words carefully. "Because talent shouldn't be wasted," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to be underestimated and overlooked." Director Gilruth, for his part, found his relationships with his staff changing as well. His decision to desegregate NASA had earned him the loyalty and respect of many black employees, but it had also created tension with some of his longtime colleagues who disagreed with the changes. He made a point of being more visible in all areas of the center, regularly visiting the computing pools and engineering departments. During these visits, he made an effort to engage with employees of all races, sending a clear message about his vision for NASA's future. One day, he overheard a heated argument between a black computer and a white engineer. Instead of ignoring it or delegating the problem, he approached the pair directly. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "we're all on the same team here. Our job is to put a man in space and bring him home safely. I suggest you both remember that and find a way to work together." His direct intervention in such situations helped to gradually shift the culture at NASA. Employees began to see that collaboration across racial lines wasn't just mandated, but was actively modeled by their leadership. As these relationships developed and deepened, they created a web of connections that strengthened the entire NASA community. The shared goal of space exploration began to overcome ingrained prejudices, creating bonds that transcended race and gender. However, these changes didn't happen overnight, and not everyone was quick to adapt. Tensions still simmered beneath the surface, and moments of conflict and misunderstanding were common. But with each passing day, as colleagues worked side by side on the monumental task of sending humans into space, the old barriers began to feel increasingly arbitrary and outdated. The story of NASA's transformation was being written not just in policy changes and grand gestures, but in these daily interactions, these slowly evolving relationships that were reshaping the heart of the organization from the inside out. The tensions that had been building since the desegregation of NASA came to a head in the lead-up to John Glenn's historic orbital flight. As the launch date approached, the pressure on every department intensified, and the lingering resentments and prejudices that had been simmering beneath the surface boiled over. Katherine Johnson had been working tirelessly on the flight calculations, double and triple checking every number. The stakes were impossibly high. The slightest error could result in tragedy. As she finalized her calculations, she discovered a discrepancy between her numbers and those generated by the new electronic computers. Trusting her work, Katherine brought the discrepancy to Al Harrison's attention. "The computer's wrong," she insisted. "These calculations need to be done by hand." Harrison, trusting Katherine's skills but also feeling the pressure of the upcoming launch, called an emergency meeting with Director Gilruth and the top engineers. The room was tense as Katherine presented her findings. As she explained the complex mathematics behind her calculations, she could see doubt and skepticism on some faces. One of the older engineers, a man who had been vocal in his opposition to integration, scoffed audibly. "Are we really going to risk an American hero's life on the word of a call? A woman?" The room fell silent. Katherine stood her ground, her voice steady as she continued to explain. Director Gilruth, seeing the gravity of the situation, made a decision that would change the course of the mission and of NASA itself. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I want you to run through these calculations one more time. Every step, we're going to check them against the computer's results." For the next 14 hours, Katherine worked nonstop, filling blackboard after blackboard with complex equations. Engineers crowded around, checking her work, asking questions. As the hours wore on, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Skepticism gave way to awe as Katherine's brilliance became undeniable. In the end, Katherine's calculations proved correct. The computer's error was identified and corrected. As the room erupted in relieved cheers, Katherine stood quietly by her blackboard, exhausted but proud. Director Gilruth approached her, extending his hand. "Miss Johnson," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you may have just saved this mission. No, you may have just saved the entire space program." The engineer who had scoffed earlier approached Katherine, his face red with shame. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything. I'm sorry." As word of Katherine's achievement spread through NASA, it became a turning point in the integration efforts. Her undeniable contribution made it impossible to continue claiming that Black employees were less capable or less important to the mission. The following day, as final preparations for John Glenn's launch were underway, Director Gilruth called another center-wide meeting. This time, when he took the stage, Katherine Johnson stood beside him. "Yesterday," Gilruth began, "we were reminded of an important truth. Talent, intelligence, and dedication know no color. Ms. Johnson's work has not only ensured the safety of tomorrow's mission, but has demonstrated beyond any doubt the value of our integration efforts. He turned to Catherine. Ms. Johnson, NASA owes you a debt of gratitude. Your calculations will carry John Glenn into orbit and bring him safely home. And your example will carry NASA into a new era of equality and excellence. As applause filled the auditorium, Catherine looked out over the crowd. She saw Dorothy and Mary, tears streaming down their faces. She saw her white colleagues, many of whom were cheering loudly. And she saw a new NASA emerging, one where talent and dedication outweighed prejudice and tradition. The space race had become more than a contest with the Soviets. It had become a proving ground for a new vision of America, one where all of its citizens could contribute and achieve, regardless of race or gender. And NASA, thanks to the brilliance and perseverance of Katherine Johnson and her colleagues, was leading the way. In the aftermath of Katherine Johnson's pivotal role in ensuring the safety of John Glenn's orbital flight, NASA found itself at a crossroads. The undeniable contributions of Catherine, Dorothy, and Mary had shattered many preconceptions, but deeply ingrained prejudices and systemic inequalities still persisted. Director Gilruth recognized that while progress had been made, there was still much work to be done to truly resolve the conflicts that had been brought to the surface. Gilruth decided to take a multi-pronged approach to address the remaining issues and foster a more inclusive environment at NASA. His first step was to create a task force on equality and inclusion, appointing Dorothy Vaughan as one of its key members. This task force was charged with reviewing NASA's hiring and promotion practices, identifying areas of persistent inequality, and recommending concrete steps for improvement. However, the formation of this task force was met with mixed reactions. Some employees, both black and white, saw it as a positive step towards addressing long-standing issues. Others viewed it with skepticism, seeing it as empty bureaucracy that wouldn't lead to real change. A vocal minority saw it as a threat to their own positions and influence within the organization. Dorothy, in her new role, faced challenges from all sides. Some of her fellow black employees felt she wasn't pushing hard enough for change, while some white employees resented her influence and questioned her qualifications. Despite these pressures, Dorothy remained focused on the task at hand, meticulously documenting disparities and proposing practical solutions. Meanwhile, Gilruth implemented a series of mandatory sensitivity training sessions for all employees. These sessions, led by civil rights educators, aimed to address unconscious biases and promote understanding across racial lines. The reactions to these sessions were varied and often intense. Some employees embraced the opportunity for self-reflection and learning, while others resisted, seeing the training as accusatory or unnecessary. During one particularly heated session, an older white engineer stood up, red-faced with anger. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed. "I've never treated anyone differently because of their race. Why should I be forced to sit through this?" The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Then, to everyone's surprise, Al Harrison, who had become one of Katherine Johnson's strongest advocates, spoke up. "Jim," he said calmly, "none of us like to think we're prejudiced. But the truth is, we've all been part of a system that's treated people unfairly. These sessions aren't about blaming us, they're about helping us do better." This exchange and others like it began to shift the conversation at NASA. Slowly, more employees began to engage with the difficult topics of race and equality, moving from defensiveness to genuine dialogue. In parallel with these efforts, Gilruth also focused on creating more opportunities for advancement for black employees. He instituted a mentorship program, pairing experienced engineers and scientists with promising young talent from all backgrounds. Mary Jackson, now progressing in her engineering studies, became a key figure in this program, mentoring young black women interested in STEM careers. Katherine Johnson's continued excellence led to her being assigned to even more critical projects. Her increased visibility and undeniable importance to the space program made her a symbol of change within NASA. However, this heightened profile also made her a target for those still resistant to integration. One morning, Catherine arrived at her desk to find a crude, racist caricature left there anonymously. Shaken but determined not to show weakness, she reported the incident to Gilruth. His response was swift and public. At an all-hands meeting later that day, Gilruth addressed the incident head-on. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, his voice stern. "This kind of behavior is not only reprehensible on a human level, it is a direct threat to our mission. The person or persons responsible for this act of harassment are actively endangering our chances of putting an American on the moon. I encourage the individual to come forward and accept responsibility. If they do not, and if we discover their identity, they will be immediately terminated." This strong stance sent a clear message throughout NASA that racism and discrimination would not be tolerated. It also provided a model for how to address such incidents directly rather than sweeping them under the rug. As these various initiatives unfolded, there were successes and setbacks. Some departments embraced change enthusiastically, actively working to create more inclusive environments. Others remained resistant, requiring ongoing intervention and oversight. Throughout this process, Gilruth leaned heavily on the insights and experiences of Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary. Their perspectives helped shape policies and practices that addressed the real-world challenges faced by Black employees at NASA. By the end of 1962, tangible progress was evident. The number of Black employees in technical and supervisory roles had increased. The once stark racial divisions in the cafeteria and other common areas had begun to blur. More white employees were actively speaking out against discrimination when they witnessed it. However, Gilruth and the task force recognized that their work was far from over. True equality would require ongoing effort and vigilance. The conflict resolution attempts had made a significant impact, but they were just the beginning of a longer journey towards genuine inclusion and equality at NASA. As the space agency continued its relentless pursuit of the moon, it was simultaneously engaged in another profound journey, one that was reshaping its internal culture and, by extension, contributing to the broader civil rights movement in America. The resolution of these conflicts was not just about improving NASA. It was about living up to the ideals of exploration and progress that the space program represented. As 1963 dawned, NASA found itself at a crucial turning point. The efforts to integrate and create a more equitable workplace had made significant strides, but they had also exposed deeper, systemic issues that would require a long-term commitment to address fully. Director Gilruth, along with Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary, realized that their work needed to extend beyond NASA's walls to create lasting change. In a bold move, Gilruth decided to leverage NASA's growing national profile to advocate for broader societal change. He announced a new initiative called Space for All, aimed at promoting STEM education and career opportunities for underrepresented groups across the country. This initiative marked a significant shift in NASA's approach. While continuing internal efforts to improve equality and inclusion, the agency would now also actively work to inspire and support the next generation of diverse scientists and engineers. Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson were appointed as key ambassadors for this program. They would travel to schools, particularly in underserved communities, to share their experiences and encourage young people to pursue careers in science and technology. The announcement of Space for All created waves both within NASA and beyond. Some praised it as a visionary step towards a more inclusive future, while others criticized it as overstepping NASA's mandate. Gilruth stood firm, arguing that diversity and scientific progress were inherently linked. This new direction also sparked internal changes at NASA. The agency began actively recruiting from a wider range of colleges and universities, including historically Black institutions. Training programs were expanded to provide more entry points for promising candidates from diverse backgrounds. For Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary, this turning point represented both a challenge and an opportunity. They were now not just NASA employees, but also public figures, tasked with representing both their race and their profession to the nation. As they prepared for their first school visits, the three women felt the weight of this new responsibility. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore," Dorothy remarked. "We're fighting for every child who's ever been told they can't do something because of the color of their skin." Catherine nodded in agreement. "And we're showing the world that NASA is leading the way, not just in space exploration, but in creating the kind of society we want to see. As NASA embarked on this new chapter, it was clear that the agency's journey towards equality would be as challenging and rewarding as its mission to reach the moon. The small step of desegregating a bathroom had led to a giant leap towards a more inclusive future, both for NASA and for the nation it served. As the Space for All initiative took shape and gained momentum, Dorothy Vaughan, Katherine Johnson, and Mary Jackson found themselves reflecting on their extraordinary journey and the profound changes they had witnessed and helped to bring about. Dorothy, now in her early 50s, marveled at how far they had come. From the segregated West Computing Group to her current position as a respected leader in NASA's integration efforts, her path had been marked by persistence and adaptability. As she prepared for another school visit, she thought about the young girl she had once been, who could never have imagined this future. "I've learned that change is possible," she confided to Katherine one evening as they worked late, preparing presentations for an upcoming conference. "But it requires more than just individual effort. It takes a willingness to challenge the system and allies who are ready to stand with you." Katherine nodded, understanding deeply what Dorothy meant. Her own growth had been just as remarkable. From a human computer whose calculations were initially dismissed or overlooked, she had become an indispensable part of NASA's most critical missions. Her confidence had grown along with her reputation, and she now spoke up without hesitation when she knew she was right. "I used to think that if I just did excellent work, everything else would fall into place," Katherine reflected. "Now I know that excellence is just the beginning. We also have to be willing to stand up, to educate, to demand the recognition and opportunities we deserve." Mary Jackson, who had finally achieved her goal of becoming an engineer, felt a particular responsibility to the young girls she spoke to through the Space for All program. She had faced and overcome so many barriers, and she was determined to make the path easier for those who would follow. "Every time I visit a school and see those young faces looking up at me," Mary said during a team meeting, "I remember why we're doing this. We're not just changing NASA, we're changing what's possible for an entire generation." The three women also reflected on how their relationships with their white colleagues had evolved. The initial tension and skepticism had, in many cases, given way to genuine respect and collaboration. They had seen firsthand how working together towards a common goal could break down barriers and change hearts and minds. Director Gilruth, too, had undergone a significant transformation. From a man primarily focused on the technical challenges of space exploration, he had become a vocal advocate for equality and inclusion. He often spoke about how his eyes had been opened to the injustices that had been happening right under his nose, and how addressing these issues had made NASA stronger. "I used to think our only mission was to beat the Soviets to the moon," he admitted during a staff meeting. "Now I understand that how we get there is just as important as reaching the goal. We have the opportunity to show America and the world what a truly merit-based, inclusive organization can achieve." As the summer of 1963 approached, bringing with it the promise of further advancements in both space exploration and civil rights, Dorothy, Katherine, and Mary looked to the future with a mixture of hope and determination. They had grown from hidden figures to public heroes, from victims of discrimination to agents of change. Yet they all knew that their work was far from over. Discrimination and inequality persisted, both within NASA and in society at large. But they faced these ongoing challenges with a new confidence, secure in the knowledge of what they had already accomplished and what was still possible. "We've come so far," Katherine said one day, as the three women watched a rocket launch, the fiery trail ascending into the blue sky. "But the real journey is just beginning. For us, for NASA, for America." Dorothy and Mary nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on the rocket as it disappeared into the heavens. They had helped to open up the skies to new explorations, and in doing so, had opened up a world of possibilities on the ground as well. As the summer of 1963 unfolded, the impact of NASA's transformation began to ripple outward. The Space for All initiative gained national attention, with Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary becoming recognizable figures in the ongoing civil rights struggle. Their stories of perseverance and triumph in the face of discrimination inspired many, both within the scientific community and beyond. NASA's commitment to equality and inclusion began to influence other government agencies and private corporations. The idea that diversity could drive innovation and progress gained traction, slowly shifting societal attitudes. At Langley, the changes were palpable. The once segregated facilities were now fully integrated, with collaboration across racial lines becoming the norm rather than the exception. The computing teams, once divided, now worked seamlessly together, their combined talents propelling NASA's missions to new heights. As the agency continued its relentless pursuit of lunar exploration, it did so with a workforce more united and diverse than ever before. The journey that had begun with a long walk to a segregated bathroom had transformed into a giant leap towards equality. Dorothy, Catherine, and Mary, standing together at a Space for All event, reflected on their incredible journey. They had not only broken barriers for themselves, but had helped to create a new path for generations to come. "We reached for the stars," Catherine said, "and in doing so, we changed the world here on Earth." Their stories served as a powerful reminder that progress often begins with small steps, that individual actions can lead to systemic change, and that the pursuit of scientific achievement and social justice can go hand in hand. As NASA continued to push the boundaries of human knowledge and exploration, it did so with a renewed commitment to the principles of equality, diversity, and inclusion, a legacy that would endure long after the first footprints were left on the lunar surface.